Good afternoon and welcome to Freedom Imaginaries webinar, Beyond Extractivism, Decolonial Perspectives from the Caribbean. My name is Melania Lane and it's a pleasure to be here with you. Today's webinar provides a multidisciplinary space to deconstruct extractivism as a legacy of colonialism and to discuss alternatives for post-colonial development. We hope to spark lively debate and discourse about how we might imagine and build futures beyond extractivism. Extractivism is often used to describe a mode of development that involves the large-scale extraction of natural resources, typically from formerly colonized nations, mostly for the benefit of shareholders and consumers in so-called developed countries. However, extractivism is much broader than the activity of natural resource extraction. It is about the structures and worldviews that European colonizers developed to accumulate capital through ecocide, indigenous dispossession, and the exploitation of racialized people. The panelists today will look at this broader concept of extractivism through their own frame of analysis. The panelists span the fields of political science, economics, decolonial theory, sociology, and human rights. We will start first with Roger Malcolm, former executive director of Jamaicans for Justice and a millennial thought leader. Following Roger, we will hear from Dr. Patricia Northover, a development economist and senior fellow at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies at the University of the West Indies, Mona. Patricia specializes in the philosophy of economics, race and critical and decolonial theory, and rural development studies. She's the author and co-author of several articles and edited volumes on the philosophy of economics, cultural dynamics, economic growth, climate change, and Caribbean development. We will then hear from Dr. Catalina Toro Perez, Associate Professor in the Department of Political Sciences at the School of Law, Political and Social Sciences at the National University of Colombia. Catalina holds a PhD in political science from the Institute of Political Studies in France. She leads the group on the political ecology of extractivism in Latin America and the Caribbean, and she has been a member of the Caribbean Studies Association since 2014. We will then hear remarks from Mimi Scheller, inaugural dean of the Global School at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Massachusetts. Until July 2021, Mimi was professor of sociology, head of the sociology department, and founding director of the Center for Mobilities Research and Policy at Drexel University in Philadelphia. She is the founding co-editor of the journal Mobilities and past president of the International Association for the History of Transport, Traffic, and Mobility. Mimi helped to establish the new mobilities paradigm and is considered to be a key theorist in critical mobilities research and in Caribbean studies. She serves on the international advisory boards for the Society for Caribbean Research, the Center for Advanced Research in Global Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, the Bowman Institute at the University of Leeds, the Asia Mobilities Research Network at Konkuk University, South Korea, and the Global Partnership for Informal Transportation. Mimi has published more than 125 articles and book chapters and is the author and co-author of 15 books, too many to mention, but I'll just mention her recent publication, which I just downloaded on Kindle, Island Futures, Caribbean Survival in the Anthropocene. Following Mimi, I will end with a response to the panelists, wearing my own hat as a human rights lawyer. I think this type of multidisciplinary dialogue is essential given the complexity of extractivism. So I look forward to the discussion and engagement with the audience. So on that note, before we begin, I'd like to do an opening poll to see where we are with this concept of extractivism. So the question should appear on your screen. So the question is extractivism a relevant or useful framework to understand development dynamics in the Caribbean? The options are yes, no, or what on earth is extractivism? So as you complete this poll, a few housekeeping matters before we begin. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. Let us know where you're zooming in from. You can ask questions at any time through the question and answer box below. And we anticipate this webinar will run until about 5 p.m. So if you have remaining questions, please feel free to reach out to us at the email that I'll share in the chat. And I think let's give a couple of seconds more for everyone to respond to the poll. Okay, so far what we see, okay, this is shifting. Okay, a few more seconds. So 75% say, let's share the results. 75% say that yes, extractivism is a relevant and useful framework to understand development dynamics in the Caribbean. And 25% ask, what on earth is extractivism? So with that mandate, I now hand over to our first speaker. It is my pleasure to introduce Roger Malcolm, and he will talk about extractivism as separation. So Roger.
Thank you, Melanie. Oh, it's fun to be here. I was one of that 25% that said, what on earth is extractivism? Because I'm still figuring that out. So my intention here today is just to share the thoughts that arose in my mind in between being asked to be on this panel and today. And I'm really interested to explore this with the panelists. And what came up for me is the importance of looking at the systems of value and background programming that we as human beings use to be in the world as a way of giving context and hopefully solutions to the things that we do to change how we are in the world. So I hope I'm not too abstract today. And so I principally think of myself as a human being figuring out how to be. And the ways that we are as human beings, meaning being is in the title of our species. We exist. There's something rich in understanding that one of the ways that human beings as reflective and storytelling entities exist is to be conscious of the way that they are being. We are human beings. And so the ways of being that we are can be characterized by certain features. One of those is what in modern times we call extractivism, but I think is largely a manifestation of a deeper way of being, which we can branch into two as being in unity and oneness with all that is, and that can get you into very spiritual discussions, or being in a version of separation from all that is and not being in a state of oneness. And in my own tradition and lineage of Raja Yoga, yoga is defined as union and oneness with all. And anything that is not that is separation, and people will have different definitions of that. And so my general takeaway that I'd like to leave people with today is that I believe that the solutions that we imagine will always support the value systems that we hold. And if we're not attentive to those value systems, we can distract ourselves with illusions of solvency. And I think we see that right now with extracting our way to green technologies, for example. But I'll pause. I'll get back to that point. So that's what I'm here to talk about. So I hope that you receive whatever resonates with you. If something doesn't resonate, you don't need to take it. I hope there's something of value. So separation. What do we mean when we say separation? Separation from nature, separation from life in all its forms, and separation from the earth itself is an idea. It's an idea that we are separate from the space that we are in, that we are separate from the ecosystem that's planet Earth. And that's the root. That's one of the root ideas that pop up in the human brain. And it's in that room that we have space for thoughts and actions to be extractivist, because we don't see ourselves in the world around us, and therefore there is room for the concept of extracting, because extracting requires distance. And so that's one way of thinking of the root thought. It's also the root thought of violence, which terminates at the same point of extractivism, separation. And so to ground this in something less ethereal, planet Earth is an ecosystem. It's just biologically and cosmically that, an ecosystem. We are its moving parts, and so is the rocks and the rivers and the birds and the fossil fuels and the air and the nitrogen and the carbon and all of that. We're all moving parts of the Earth's ecosystem. And the nature of this existence of an ecosystem is mirrored everywhere. Our body's an ecosystem. There's more microbes in our body than human cells. They reveal themselves in the diversity of what we're willing to see, quite frankly, and the more we're willing to see it, the more it becomes self-evident. And so the more we examine that, we realize that life is profoundly entangled. And so the concept of separateness, right, separation, separateness, operates consciously and subconsciously, and gives rise to patterns of behavior among human beings, which, due to our position of dominance on the planet and the accelerant of machine technology, our version of separation can produce disastrous impacts on the world. And so there is a responsibility in understanding the root cause of our actions. And so the nature of extractivism, in my opinion, rests on the following principles of separation. One, it requires an illusion of separation, that there's an illusion that we are not part of the ecosystem, not just inhabitants of Earth that can planet hop with money, but that we are in fact Earth, and there's lots of spiritual teachings that talk about human beings being formed from Earth. You don't have to be religious to just understand the allegory. And so the illusion of separation is the groundwater, and then that allows human beings to then misunderstand the nature of our participation in a living ecosystem called Earth, a living ecosystem. From that misunderstanding of our participation, conceptualize systems of value that are based on separateness. An example of that is capitalism. Another example of that is racism, or racialized capitalism, or colonialism. It's a system of value that locates value in warped ways that would be incompatible with seeing unity in all things. And then thirdly, and this is the part where it comes into the real world, based on that misunderstanding and then the system of value, we organize human affairs based on those systems of value in ways that are damaging. And this is where we get our agricultural system, mining, energy, how we sustain ourselves, our material and non-material culture, why and how and what we consume, and the culture of consumption itself. And so the result is that we have human relations that are not in right relationship with Earth. And that's characterized by extraction and violence as the background programming. In a given time and space context, it will manifest differently. Today, we decry logging, burning, deforestation in the Amazon. Centuries ago, it was degenerative farming in the once fertile crescent, which is now a desert because of extractive agriculture. It looks now and then, like large-scale industrial fishing that's committing underwater ecocide. And it also looks now and then like the system of colonialism, which is built on extracting from faraway places to violently try to sustain something unsustainable, which is the way that we've organized human affairs in the project that we call civilization. So the flavors, terms, languages, conceptual packaging will change, but the root idea is separation from whether at a kind of like a philosophical context, or if you want to go as high as a metaphysical context, that separation is the room within which one can rationalize extraction. And so this is contrasted against a human way of being that is based on recognition of unity of all life, that results in human affairs being organized in what people would call a relationship of stewardship. And I don't think of it as a binary continuum, but for the purpose of this conversation, let's construct one of those. You can have extraction and then you have stewardship, or extractivism and then you have stewardship. And these are paradigms, not activities. So they're systems of thought and value that determine our actions in the world, whether we realize them or not. And a lot of it is unconscious, but they're not activities. And so in both paradigms, resources may be taken from the earth. In both paradigms, human civilizations may very well organize themselves into these sedentary patterns that want to resist change. That's really what civilization is, change around, and create the impulse to manage the environment that makes it hospitable for us to inhabit a space. That's civilization in a nutshell. That impulse may just occur in both paradigms, but what changes is the nature of the ways of organizing human affairs. What changes is the how, and more importantly, the why, and the what really is what floats to the top. And so with that in mind, a way of thinking about healing separation, which is my thesis on what a future beyond extractivism is. It's just a form of healing separation. We actually start with the why and less the what, and because I suspect that a narrow focus on the what, which technology we're using to power our homes, what energy source we're using to create a teddy bear to sell, because someone marketed it on TV, is a little bit more of a distraction from what may be a more pertinent question if we're dissatisfied with our relationship with Earth, which is, why are we organizing civilization and human affairs in the way that we are? I don't want mining, of oil, for example, to fuel power plants. I also really don't want deep sea mining of rare earth minerals to power solar cars, or to destroy whole islands mining silicon for solar panels. Both of them are extracting, just with different labels, and so it allows us to start with why, which is how human society is organized. And that may feel like a really, really big question, but it's at the root of all of it. We can't green technology our way out of consumerism. We'll just change the energy source to make it more palatable for a particular politics in time space. We can't extract our way out of an energy crisis if our ways of being are unsustainable. We don't want to find clean ways to sustain a broken system, in my opinion. And so that leaves space for just lesser evil rationality, as opposed to imagination of a different future that heals separation. And so that's the idea I intend to seed, and I'm hoping that some of this is sticking for you, because the solutions that we imagine will always support the value systems that we hold. And this is really one of the problems that we see afflicting the modern climate justice movement. I don't know if I can really call it climate justice. It's more like the modern renewable tech industry that I'm talking about particularly. And a good example of this is it's become a flavor of extractivism, because we're seized with a really urgent what, but blind to the why and the how in many respects. And those persons seeking to flesh out and flush into our awareness the whys and the hows of how we've organized human society, who call themselves environmentalists as well, find themselves at odds within a movement that ostensibly is about justice, earth justice, climate justice, but now finds itself bitterly divided over the what, because of a state of the why being in shadow. And by shadow, I just mean beyond, not in our conscious awareness, not being probed as part of the solution finding. And so, for me, that sounds like probing the ways that we are in separation. And so my goal is not to condemn everybody for living in a system that they had no part in designing and they struggled to reimagine. I'm talking to you through a computer that was made probably under terrible conditions. My hope is that, however, that we will think of beyond extractivism as a shift to the why behind everything. I mean, and I really do mean everything. Why we have cities, why we use energy the way that we do, why we have a taste for sweet things and therefore demand really sweet products, and in monoculture, cane farms, why we do so much things at night using artificial light when we don't really need to, if we organize ourselves differently. Why do we sell our time for money called a job? I'm not anti-money, I quite love money, but there's a probing of why do we organize ourselves in this way? So much of that's deep in the shadow and is actually the root of separation that I suspect, little me, that the process of coming into awareness of the nature of human civilization is a process of healing separation, is a process of beyond extractivism. And so how can we imagine some of that moving forward, right? Beyond that kind of cosmic stuff. So the future beyond extractivism is a regenerative future. That's a nice term that's come in vogue now. And it really encapsulates a form of stewardship and ecological responsibility that human beings can bring to the table that's not been as mainstream in our modern society. So let's look on something as simple as agriculture. This is where it's, I think, easiest to understand. Agriculture is probably the human being's earliest extractive industry. So we can talk for ages just about the climate change it has caused, the biodiversity loss, the desertification, the loss of small water cycles, this sort of like large clear cropping monoculture capitalist extraction of food at the cost of all other life in an area. We've lost so much topsoil. And it's a result of large-scale urban culture, which kills everything in its area, then tries to bring in things because it's no longer a viable ecosystem, and then figures out what to do with its waste because there are no cycles like there are in nature, separation. However, because we've been doing it for so long, we've actually found new ways to cultivate food that matches our sedentary lifestyle that aren't terrible. And this is regenerative agriculture, which is premised on the principle of the food production process, quote, increasing the life carrying capacity of the ecosystem it's proximate to. So it tends towards life, which is a tendency towards unity. And so regenerative agriculture is taking on, it's working to rehabilitate whole ecosystems, and it switches the model of human relationship with food or basic form of sustenance, which is why it's quite real for people, from separation to stewardship, and is actually a lovely example of a future beyond extractivism. Now, we would take a lot of time to talk about the features of regenerative agriculture. I think other speakers will speak about more real world things, but this is a solid example of switching the system of value, because when the system of value was yield, was getting as much corn for the money that you input and nothing else could come into the equation of value, then there was no space for understanding that agriculture was extractive, because value was externalized and the inputs were instrumentalized. And so that's a separatist mindset and philosophy. That's a background programming. We don't actually have to think about that to not question it. We don't question where our food comes from many times unless you have chosen to look at the background programming. And so all of the actions that we take in the world are just based on that programming. And so the regenerative future looks like more and more probing of the assumptions that are in how we've organized human affairs to create regenerative systems. I think Mimi will speak a little bit about regenerative economies as well. And so that requires, when you bring it out of just agriculture to systems and economies, it aggregates to earth justice, and not just climate justice necessarily, which feels a little bit abstract and academic, but really earth justice and planetary consciousness, that recognizes the interconnectivity of all forms of life. And with that form of consciousness, and it took us a hot minute to get here, so it may take us a hot minute to get out, extractivism just doesn't have any room to exist because value will be determined differently. And so healing the earth is, in my opinion, a process of healing separation, which makes it way more achievable, in my opinion, because this is my next point, and I am watching time. Our personal responsibility, if we want regenerative futures, in my opinion, have to do with the way that we, and I don't mean the collective big picture human beings, I mean we, me and you in this call, live our lives. And if we live our lives extractively, or as human stewards, I do think there's a strong personal responsibility. And there is, for me, a risk of tackling systems in a way that's devoid of personal transformation. It gives you things like really damaging hydroelectric dams because they're less polluting than fossil fuels. It gives you consumerist renewable tech. Tackle systems we must, don't get me wrong, but the well that we're drawing from, or inspiration from, or ideas from, must be deep enough to actually be transformative and fit for purpose. And so an aspect of that includes us as individuals becoming aware of what our personal truth is in relation to human affairs. And I do believe in that respect, everything is inner work. And that inner work helps combat the feeling of hopeless too largeness that can kind of like envelop us when we're trying to tackle global problems. That how on earth are we going to change the system? What does that look like? What are all the whats and the hows? And I think there's tremendous power in recognizing that the basic unit of our analysis is the human being, the singular human being, and all of our actions are just aggregations of scale. And some of us are called to work at different scales. Some of us are differentially influential and powerful to work on different scales, but we're all equally able to work on ourselves 100%. And that will look differently for different people. And so I propose that becoming attentive to the ways that we participate in extractivism is the beyond extractivism that can start right now, without judgment or self-blame, but for the purpose of awareness, or relationships with others, for example, or personal resource management, and the assumptions that we repeat and we accept about how human society is organized that we oftentimes leave in the shadow. I think that's really oftentimes the work. And I would suggest then that as we translate that work or inner work and conceive of our individual futures beyond extractivisms, our whys and hows will float to the surface, and they'll be so unique and amazing, because imagine the human imagination that is destroying our forests, that took us to the moon, that created artificial intelligence, is the same human imagination that, if directed towards stewardship and regeneration, can take us exactly out. What's changing is the background programming that informs that imagination. So in closing, how do we then make this real? And provide real solutions after we've done all this airy fairy stuff? Well, other speakers are going to talk about that. They're really well studied on the real world solutions. But I would say that as an extension of our inner questioning, we're called to propose for ourselves and others, but firstly for ourselves, harmonious ways of being for humans, healthy ways to organize our systems. And the generation of those ideas is a process of both remembering and imagining. And if you leave with nothing else, I really want this to stick. It's a process of remembering and imagining. Remembering, perhaps through study of history or whatever, the ways that human civilizations and planet Earth has existed for however long. For our own knowledge, for inspiration, for caution, and for context, we must remember in order to make sense. We must also remember the way that others who sought balance with the Earth and organized themselves that way did it. We don't have to copy them or turn back time. We don't want to go back to the Stone Age and just use stones. But there's an understanding and a remembering that is essential to expose background programming. We also have to remember how our programming got there. We were socialized into it. It's not natural. We had to be taught it and punished for deviation. And we see this right now in the systems of socialization that allow us to accept extractivism, capitalism as default and the norm. And then we're allowed to then, with those two prerequisites, imagine ways of healing separation without the limiting beliefs that are embedded in extractivism and colonialism and capitalism, or whatever name we give the ism that's no longer serving us. And the human imagination, if directed towards regeneration, if directed towards stewardship, towards coming into right relationship with the earth, can 100% most definitely move us there. It simply needs to be energized and freed. And our individual and collective confronting of the nature of our human affairs, which is a difficult thing to confront, is what's required to unlearn, to remember, and to imagine. And if we can embark on that, I think we will be able to see and conceive, which I don't think we can really do without doing that, what a truly regenerative future beyond extractivism could look like. It's what else can we do? And so in the context that the other speakers will bring, I just want to encapsulate those real world stuff in what's required at the realm of thought and at the realm of the subconscious assumptions about society. That's the container in which a regenerative future can come to realization and then come to form. And so thank you, and I hope that some of this was useful for you, and I appreciate your time and attention.
Well, thanks so much, Roger, for your cosmic presentation and extraction as separation, and I really love your call for healing separation. So if you're just joining us, welcome to Beyond Extractivism, Decolonial Perspectives from the Caribbean. We hope that this webinar will provide a conceptual foundation for future webinars in this series, which will focus on the impact of extractivism on specific communities. The idea here is that we have to deconstruct before we can tackle, reconstruct, and as Roger said, collectively heal. On that note, we now move on to our second panelist, Patricia Northover, who will discuss extractivism as reproduction of abject Blackness. Patricia, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Give me a second here. Okay. So greetings, one and all. I really resonated with Roger's very powerful intervention, first contributions, reflecting on the nature of whether or not we take a value orientation that focuses on our relationality and the intrinsic relationships that are necessary to sustain our planetary existence versus one that focuses on separation. And I think what he was speaking to is very much consistent with the ideas that inform my own perspective. And as I've learned through scholars such as Edward Glisson and his powerful work, A Poetic of Relation and Poetic Intention. So thank you very much, Roger, for that powerful intervention and framing of the issues. I want to thank Elaine, the organizer of this event, for provoking me to speak on this topic of extractivism, given our budding solidarity on the struggle against extractivism in the Caribbean. For my part, I wish to offer an interpretation of extractivism as the reproduction of abject Blackness, something that works through an imperial politics of primitive accumulation. And I hope I will be able to make clear those points. So I'm hoping that this perspective may guide how we perceive and express a decolonial attitude towards extractivism, much in the same way as Roger has fundamentally highlighted the value systems under which separation dominates to facilitate the model of extractivism. So the first slide actually should have been up. Hello? All right, could you put the second slide on? Okay, so while in the global history of capitalism, reference to primitive accumulation often signals processes of violent extractivism involving land and body grabbing, enslavement, mining, expulsions, and dispossession that serve the nascent economic needs of an emergent bourgeoisie, as Marx argued, there is a need to go beyond the stagist, instrumentalist, and materialistic reading of primitive accumulation in order to discover its political characteristics, as Rosa Luxemburg sought to do in her analysis of the relations between imperialism and the accumulation of capital. In this brief comment, I wish to continue in this vein of stretching Marxist analysis to address the political from the point of view of the damned of the earth, as Fanon proposed. Next slide. That is, I wish to explore the capitalist logic of extractivism as a mode of primitive accumulation that is composed and defined by not just structurally violent expulsions for natural resource extraction, but also by imperial formations which reproduce what I refer to as a politics of abject Blackness. Now, there is, of course, a large and growing literature re-examining primitive accumulation as an ongoing dynamic process of dispossession and expulsion. For example, David Harvey's oft-cited work, The New Imperialism, 2003. His work presents a mature capitalism as operating through a politics of accumulation by dispossession, or ABD for short. For Harvey, ABD is pivotal to the neoliberal project under a contemporary hegemony of financial capitalism. In line with David Harvey and others, such as Saskia Sassen, primitive accumulation is interpreted as an ongoing process of expulsion and extraction, palpable in events such as the racially predatory nature of the subprime mortgage housing crisis in the United States of America, or the third world debt crisis, or the new land grabbing substantially concentrated in Africa, and yet again in the Caribbean, whether in the guise of disaster capitalism, or in the new oil and mineral extractivist ventures, now again focused on Haiti for prospecting and mining for gold in its northern region, and more recently in resource wealthy and now oil-rich Guyana. However, despite the increased attention to primitive accumulation, analysts still differ on how best to describe the constitution or form of primitive accumulation, as well as the extent of its economic and political significance within contemporary accumulation processes. Notwithstanding these contentions concerning the theorization and explanatory power of primitive accumulation, Most Marxist analysis tends to agree with Rosa Luxemburg and David Harvey that capitalism needs, and I quote, to create its own other, end of quote, and is unviable without these othered domains of inclusive exclusions. This means that in capitalist reproduction processes, as Massimo De Angeli put it, there is a basic ontological connection between primitive accumulation and expanded reproduction. Primitive accumulation was never then just a stage of emergent or early colonial capitalism, but rather operates as an ontological condition for the general reproduction of capitalism itself. As such, contemporary expressions of capitalism are governed by this logic of capture, expulsion, and extraction as a sine qua non for the maintenance of the reproductive and productive social relations of capital, and relatedly, for the perpetuation of the relentless commodification of things as an ongoing generative process. Next slide. Now, I wish to go further to posit that this process of primitive accumulation that depends on a violent relationship between capital and its others, or the other outside of itself, to sustain the expanded reproduction of capitalism, also integrates processes of objectification that compose modern sovereignty itself. Modern sovereignty is understood here as a material and symbolic relation of forces necessary for ostensive powers of command, final authority, and indefinite control in processes for globalizing particular places. Modern sovereignty thus inheres in relations of coloniality that are characterized by an aim for the domination of all of reality. More specifically, my proposition is that this sovereign force and modern social imaginary is expressed whenever the idea and action of primitive accumulation works through a structure of disavowal that denies the propriety of the other, that is, deems them as not being suitable or fitting to appropriate from that which he, she, them, they has a proper right to possess. By operating through such a structure of disavowal, the modern exercise of primitive accumulation sets up an inherent division in the human condition, like that of original sin, which disposes some people to becoming abject or perpetually liable to a violence of expulsion and non-belonging, while establishing others as sole claimants to appropriate on grounds of an exclusive proprietary of right, and relatedly a deduced power of rightful possession against which there can be no proper resistance. This, I believe, is the core point of decolonial figures such as Du Bois, Césaire, Fanon, Glissant, and Sylvia Wynter. Saidiya Hartman also calls attention to this problem of abjectness in her critical unearthing of the violent archives of the history of modernity in the womb of human trafficking and enslavement. Thus, as she argues, and I quote, assertions of free will, singularity, autonomy, and consent necessarily obscure relations of power and domination. She goes on to say, and I quote, the genealogy of freedom discloses the intimacy of liberty, domination, and subjection. This intimacy is discerned in the inequality enshrined in property rights, the conquest and captivity that establish, quote unquote, we the people, and the identity of race as property, whether evidenced in the corporal inscriptions of slavery and its badges, or in the bounded bodily integrity of whiteness, secured by the abjection of others, end of quote. Accordingly, as emphasized by Sabine Brock, and I quote, the founding difference of early Euro-American societies was subject and abject, of sovereign self versus sovereignlessness, of thinged property versus the subject. Taking a cue from Julia Kristeva in her work, Powers of Horror, I focus on the relationship between the sovereign and the abject, which I have interpreted as intimating a ghostly state of being without place. That is, a sublime state of disavowal, which I characterize as abject blackness in an earlier work. This sovereign-abject relation of forces is historically constituted by a racialized philosophy of place, which produces a spectral relation between modern sovereignty as absolute place and proper presence, given its unpresentable other. That is, the other that is forced to inhabit and invoked placelessness, as marked by absolute cognates, such as having no place, being dislocated in non-place, or inhabiting positions and bodies that are out of place. Slide 5. Ooh, next slide. In this politically generative role of primitive accumulation, this politically generative role of primitive accumulation evolves through a primitive appropriation process that cuts a sovereign figure with absolute standing vis-a-vis the abject. And it is this sovereign abject relation specific to disavowals of appropriation rights that one can create and sustain socio-political borders, social spaces, places, and bodies in a bid to ensure and secure the ceaseless economic logic of extraction and the expanded reproduction of capitalist economies. This reading of primitive accumulation, I believe, aligns well with Rosa Luxemburg's original thesis that imperialism exists as the intrinsic political modality of capitalist accumulation. Finally, in unpacking this relational dynamics of dispossession and extraction through primitive accumulation, key feminist interventions such as Sylvia Fabiani's, Anne McClintock's, or more recently, Paula Shakvatry and Denise da Silva, I apologize if I mispronounced, in their essays, also disclose the fact that a process of primitive accumulation is unthinkable outside of its entanglement of gender with race in powers of capitalist production. To conclude then, next slide, I argue that the DNA of modern powers of capitalist extractivism as a mode of primitive accumulation has been, and can only be founded on imperial formations and reproduced through complex racial assemblages of power. Laura Ann Stoller defines imperial formations as racialized relations of allocation and appropriation. However, as she in her essay on imperial debris, ruins, and ruination also points out, imperial formations do not focus on empire per se, but rather on, and I quote, the ongoing quality of processes of decimation, displacement, and reclamation. End of quote. The retuning of plantation agricultural systems into mineral and debt extractivist ones is undoubtedly structured by imperial formations' relations of forces. But these forces are not to be read as fixed forms of sovereignty and its denials, but rather, as Sola states again, as gradated forms of sovereignty and what has long marked the technologies of imperial rule, sliding and contested scales of differential rights. End of quote. So, final slide. For the average person in the Caribbean or plantation America, extractivism is more than just a legacy of global plantation spaces, but rather an ongoing lived experience of imperial formations composing capitalist worlds. These imperial formations shape the texture of the government of things and populations, as well as the character of nation states by way of racialized relations, which facilitate the reproduction of structural violence and persistent poverty. I conclude then that a decolonial stance on extractivism must thus strive to decompose and recompose this character of the political upon which primitive accumulation rests for the capitalist ordering of things. Thank you for your attention.
Wow, thank you, Patricia, for your very insightful presentation on extractivism as not just structurally violent expulsion, but also imperial formations that reproduce abject Blackness. So before we hear from our next panelist, I'd like to do another poll on extractivism, just to see where we are. And the question should appear on your screen now. So the question this time is a future beyond extractivism possible? The options are yes, we are already building that future. Yes, but not in our lifetime. Or no, extractivism is too deeply entrenched in the social imaginary. So as you complete the poll, please enjoy this brief musical interlude. Feel free to stretch, take a sip of your favorite beverage, or introduce yourselves in the chat and let us know your thoughts on extractivism. Okay, so our results are in. So the responses to the question, is a future beyond extractivism possible? We have 63% saying yes, we are already building that future. I totally receive that. We have 22% saying yes, but not in our lifetime. And we have 16% saying no, extractivism is too deeply entrenched in the social imaginary. So with these perspectives from the audience, I would like to invite our next panelist, Catalina Toro de Perez, who will present on her, her perspectives on extractivism. Catalina?
Thank you very much. Well, I thank you, my colleagues that presented before me. They were very powerful. I will try to say something about the political ecologies in the Caribbean from what we have built in Latin America in these past 2 decades, and what we call the Latin American political ecology, a field of work that has become a field of critical thinking of international relevance that is being forged in the midst of social struggles over life territories involved in social and environmental conflicts at different scales and circumstances. As part of diverse emerging ecologies, what we call ecologies from the South, it has critically addressed the power knowledge crisis of the modern colonial world system and built alternatives to dispossession and cultural and environmental devastation. Marginalized regions, social groups, peoples from diverse nationalities, including minority groups with their diverse culture and epistemes, emerge in processes of building what we call re-existence expressions in the setting of epistemic and political struggles. An important theoretical political challenge of the political ecologies of the South has been to strengthen a constructive dialogue between academia and social movements, since these movements of local peoples in a territorial base make important contributions to understand that dynamic of the ecological crisis and the organized action of active resistance. This means an approach to a planetary and civilizational crisis, as Lander Huttard wrote, and studied the unraveling power relations and the power in knowledge that determines ways of thinking, extracting nature and culture in the Caribbean. This means to recognize two processes that are presented separately. In one hand, the expansion and reproduction of the geopolitics of extractivism in the territories of the South, and in the other, the force and collective capacity of creating alternatives and political decisions from various associative forms of production and reproduction of the commons. The epistemological debate against the destructive modern colonial development model in recent political ecology in Latin America and the Caribbean is rooted in a broad, diverse, theoretical, political, and territorial practice which characterize a region. This approach is nurtured by environmental philosophy and history, subaltern and postcolonial studies, political economy, and critical political geography. I intend to build an itinerary of these diffuse pathways in the construction of this field in a context. Identifying the Caribbean political ecology idea supposes an ontological reflection about our own existence. That's why environmental history and political geography help us to understand the myth of the discovery or uncovery, as Dussel and Boff sustain, and the ideas of tropicalization of the third world narrative construction. Extractivism are a particular type of appropriation of nature, natural resources that consist of the removal, extraction of large volumes, and that for the most part are exported as raw materials. Some authors, as Gudina's 2018, have described this type of extractivism anchored locally but dependent on globalization. Extractivisms, on the one hand, generate local impacts, such as impacts on biodiversity or people's health, and on the other, generate effects on economic and political dynamics, such as regulations, limits to information, participation, and cuts in the rights of the people. Extractivisms, on the one hand, also help us to understand global and historical comprehension of the dynamics of the driving forces of the Spanish conquest. The today big-scale mining and oil exploitation in the Andean region and the Caribbean is associated to the very genesis of modernity, intrinsically linked to the modernity coloniality project, as Fanon Machado Luxembourg defended, as it subordinates nature and cultures, generating dispossession and environmental devastation. In a recent debate in political ecology, we find that there's one of the most important features on today's Latin American and the Caribbean extractivism is the persistent coloniality of nature. We're linking extractivism to capitalism and neocolonialism. The coloniality of nature, this category created by Héctor Alimonda, 2011, shows the persistence of a devastation that destroys and disorganizes ecosystems, classifies and subalternizes peoples, natures, and cultures by anthropocentric narratives of the origin of modernity, highlights the role of nature and culture seen as a resource to be exploited in colonial spaces. Nature embodies as a resource in the genesis of modernity, highlighting the presence of this coloniality of tropical nature in the European self-sufficiency to produce modernity and capitalism. It is explained in the globalized interactions between Europe and its colonies, instead of being a self-generated process in which capitalist modernity is the result of the transcontinental transactions that begin with the conquest, colonization, and dispossession of the Americas. From this perspective, the imperial discovery will involve the production of devices that internalize and subtract what was discovered in order to colonize and exploit it. Nature was undervalued by the colonizers who destroyed its valuable biodiversity to implant monoculture of exotic species for export. The Caribbean and the Brazilian Northeast are going to set the first areas to be colonized by this production regime for exploitation, forestry, mining, and establishment of the plantation economy. The development of the economy of the slave trade, the control of ports, the slave plantation model in the Caribbean, and the processes of logging and mining in this area will lay the economic foundations of the colonization patterns, which will later give rise to the enclave economies of the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century that will become the model of capitalist expansion in the region in the 21st. In terms of extractivism and colonialism, neo-extractivism and neocolonialism are concepts very closely linked to each other since the incorporation of our America to the development of the world market from the 16th century that may be represented as the inequitable and asymmetric integration form of Latin America and the Caribbean to the world economy since the end of the colonial era. Neo-extractivism in the Caribbean implies a new form of colonization. Along with the imposition of colonial education, systems, languages, religions, and culture during the 20th century, the Western Caribbean, where I lived and I work, region became, with the commodity boom in the 21st century, the last global imperial commodity frontier. Extractive narratives associated to mining mega projects, offshore oil and gas extraction projects, mega structure as ports and channels within its shipping routes from China to Europe, deepening the various types of socio-environmental conflicts appear in the geopolitics of colonial heritage, of alienation and dispossession of African American and indigenous communities who have fought against colonial regimes since the conquest. In this context, the new Caribbean environmental thinking acquires a clear decolonizing and anti-extractivist character in a most sustained anti-essentialist approach to nature, modern culture, positivist science, naturalizing boundaries in and the absence of neatly bounded identities in the root of modern culture of white capitalism patriarchy with its subordination of nature, woman, and race. Combining Latin America environmental history and political ecology perspective, we look for a historicized reading of the making and thinking of social and natural worlds. Building upon other proposals from feminist approaches, we're studying the neo-extractivist, neo-colonialist, and neo-patriarchal domination process taking place in the Western Caribbean in the 21st century. From this perspective, the environmental crisis of the Caribbean is closely related to the model of extraction, control, and thinking, related to colonial subordination of minds, bodies, and nature, which is reflected in the inequitable and asymmetrical integration of Latin America and the Caribbean to the world economy since the 16th century. Neo-extractivism in the insular and continental Caribbean world implies not only a new form of territorial colonization in the context of the construction of the imaginary of the nation state from the 19th century until today, with the imposition of languages, religion, culture, and the values of the internal colonialist model, the Western Caribbean became, at the dawn of the 21st century, the last imperial frontier, last stage of development for extractive activities of the great scale of exploitation of raw materials. In a context of global oil price crisis, Colombia, Panama, Honduras, Nicaragua, among others, are deepening the extractive supply in the Western Caribbean without taking into account its impacts on the quality of life of local communities. I'm going to present some slides, short slides. I think I'm over time to try to show where we are. Okay. So we are assuming that extractivism is now, it has to be seen in a neo-extractivism model of capitalism in the Caribbean that are related with extractivism. Well, I already exposed the concept that Eduardo Gudinas had developed in 2018 related with the experience in Ecuador and Bolivia, extractivism anchored, an activity anchored locally but dependent on globalization. It's very important to be clear that when we talk about extractivism, we're talking about large volumes that are exported as raw materials. But there's also, well, this is one of the pictures in Colombia, one of the rivers in Colombia before the commodity boom and after the commodity boom, where you see all the pollution on toxic materials. But what is important, related with the concept of Gudinas, of his concept of extraction, is its relation with the high volumes, the intensity, and the destiny of the extraction. And here I want just to point out what somebody asked in the chat. This is one of the charts of Gudinas making a relation with volume, intensity, and extraction. When he's saying that the types of the big volumes, big intensity, and high amount of materials to be exported, just as minerals, hydrocarbons, monocultures. In the Caribbean, we start to work also in tourism. Tourism, because that means that we're extracting, or that this kind of industry extracts water, extracts money and cultures. So this is one of the specific kinds of extractivism from the Caribbean related with tourism. And the other one is industrial fisheries, which means that high volume, high intensity, and high levels of extraction of natural resources, if we are thinking like in the way Gudinas is showing us his concept of extractivism for the global market, then we are talking about extractivism. What is changing in this concept of extractivism is what somebody called the new frontiers of extractivism. What does that mean? That means that we're talking about extreme energy, big projects of extraction of resources as fracking, for example, big mining projects and big agricultural projects are part of these new frontiers extractivism or extreme extractivism. And in the experience of Latin America, Alberto Acosta and Eduardo Gudinas had differentiated the traditional extractivism to neo-extractivism. Neo-extractivism more related to this idea of illusion, the developmental illusion, the sum of the progressist political regimes had in Latin America, as Correa, Kirchner, and Morales, who defended the big mining projects and the big and the fracking projects, for example, in Argentina. But this neo-extractivist model is completely different from the traditional extractive colonial model, which is the model that we have, for example, in Colombia, that is we are subordinating our export to United States, for example, under the free trade convention. We're talking about big scale exploitation, open mega mining, and that goes not to the big difference between this concept, extractivism and now extractivism in these two kinds of regime is that that the big projects in the what we call the progressist regimes are nationalized. That means that the extractive industry is subordinated to global markets, but through a nationalist model which redistribute the gains to the population and for those who are the poorer, completely different to our traditional extractivism under free trade agreements, economies experiment that we have in Colombia, Peru, Chile, and Mexico under an intensive exploitation models. I think I've already finished my time. Just only want to show you some of these difference in our debates in Latin America and the relation that has these two kinds of extractivism related with the indicators in Colombia, Peru, the human development indicators decrease, while in some moment of these extractivism regimes under Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, for example, in the first years of the 21st century, Bolivia, Argentina, Ecuador, Brazil had increased their human development indicators. So this there's a big difference under the two kind of regimes. So that was more or less these differences that Alberto Acosta and Gudinas had developed between these two kind of governments, and finally, well, the impacts, the social and environmental impacts that this extraction finally has in local populations, and what is coming to these countries as Colombia, Peru, or Mexico, that are the countries with the most number of conflicts, social and environmental conflicts, which is one of the categories we in Latin America explore and develop on the studies on political ecology in the field of social and environmental conflicts. I will leave here because I have a lot more to tell you about our work in the Caribbean related with mining and petrol and oil exploitation and history and the geopolitics of these extraction, but I think we are going to have 3 more webinar series, so I think we can develop a little more what we are just building in the geopolitical point of view. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks so much, Catalina. I really hope this is the beginning of many more exchanges with you. So just a reminder to the audience, please feel free to share any questions in the question and answer box. And at the end of this presentation segment, we will have hopefully a lively question and answer period. So we will now hear from Mimi Scheller, and she will talk about Caribbean futures beyond extractivism.
Thank you, Melina, and thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. And I'm going to give a much more basic overview of extractivism. My wonderful learned colleagues have given really extensive thought to this. And I came in thinking maybe our audience would be less familiar with some of the academic literature in the field, but would be interested just to hear about some of the things going on in the region. And I'll begin by saying a few things about how I think about extractivism, which I've learned through reading really Latin American and Caribbean scholarship. So extractivism, we can think of it as the exploitation of natural landscapes, living entities, minerals, metals, energy sources for the benefit of capitalist profit. As we've already heard, it's grounded in coloniality. It includes slavery, mining, plantation agriculture, factory farming, commercial fishing, mega dams, oil drilling, and in general, the plunder and destruction of the earth. As Gomez Barrios describes it, extractivism is an economic system that engages in thefts, borrowings, and forced removals, violently reorganizing social life as well as the land by thieving resources from indigenous and Afro-descendant territories. So this fits with what we heard Patricia Northover describe as forms of primitive accumulation and dispossession. But as we heard from Roger, extractivism is also an ideology premised, as he said, on separation, and more specifically, as Pat argued, through Black abjection, the processes that relate to racism, othering, and generally not caring about the impact of one's actions on others and on the natural world. Extractivism has neither conscience, nor ethics, nor justice. And also, extractivism constantly moves. It uses up landscapes and lives, giving back nothing and leaving behind pollution, waste, and poverty as it shifts to the next place. So in a Caribbean perspective, I started thinking about these extractive sacrifice zones through work I was doing on Jamaica when I was researching my book, Aluminum Dreams, The Making of Light Modernity, and realizing the extent to which the entire infrastructure of modernity, of speed, of lightness, of packaging, of all forms of consumption depends on bauxite mining through this, the making of this light metal, which some of you probably call aluminium. And this map of Jamaica shows the bauxite alumina operations in Jamaica. And you can see the extent of the areas. This is a historical map, but it shows the extent of the areas that were being leased for bauxite mining or that were considered places where bauxite could be mined. And the red triangle, those are the yellow areas, and the red triangles showing where alumina refinery plants were based. And bauxite mining is a form of strip mining. It destroys the land, takes away all the topsoil, leaves behind toxic red mud lakes, as they're called, and then it's converted into a powdered aluminum oxide through these refineries, and then it gets exported out to smelters around the world, where the final part of the process consumes huge amounts of energy in their smelting. And I learned a lot about this working with my colleague Esther Figueroa, who with Emile Martin is the organizer of the Global Extraction Film Festival, which has been happening for the last few days, the second annual film festival. And I hope some of you have had a chance to watch some of those films. What I've learned working with Esther and others on the global extraction stories from around the world is the extent to which the Caribbean is a site of oil refineries, as well as mining of gold, of bauxite, and of oil extraction and drilling. And I think most people who see the Caribbean as a tourism region, they don't realize the degree of extractive industry that is happening there. So I think that's a really important baseline. And I know you can't read this map, but this gives you a sort of general overview of part of the Caribbean's connection to this sort of global energy production system. But extraction also is about human relations. Extractivism has been theorized more broadly by Caribbean and Latin American thinkers, as we've already begun to hear today, in terms of this colonial and imperial exploitation of people through racial capitalism, extracting labor through slavery, coercion, underpayment. Tourism too can be described as a kind of extractive industry, especially when it exploits nature and workers, destroying habitats and communities. And this is something I started thinking about when I wrote my book in 2003 called Consuming the Caribbean, which looked at the consumption of nature, of landscapes, of plantation agricultural systems, consumption of laboring bodies, and then how that could be brought forward to the consumption of bodies and labor within tourism. And these, of course, have racialized and gendered and classed aspects to how that extraction of human labor takes place, both productive labor and reproductive labor. And many have now argued, and we've heard Catalina talk about neo-extractivism, that modern states, even progressive ones, even left-wing, even socialist states, enable and normalize resource exploitation that ends up perpetuating anti-Indigenous and anti-Black racism. So with that kind of context, I just wanted us to look briefly at, okay, well, what's happening with extractive industries in the Caribbean region? What are some of the impacts? And these are stories just from this summer. This is just July and August. So on the right side in July, the Lime Tree Bay oil refinery in St. Croix, which is part of the US Virgin Islands, was ordered to shut down because they were raining oil and toxic chemicals on an entire community. They were poisoning people, poisoning the water, poisoning plants and animals. They then declared bankruptcy in August and have more or less disappeared without doing anything to pay for the harms that they've caused. Meanwhile, in August, in Jamaica, the Jamalco alumina plant in Clarendon was hit by a major fire, which crippled operations. And this is not the first time that alumina plants have been the site of problems in Jamaica, and they pollute the air. They have communities living very close to them, and they, again, pour out toxic chemicals that affect people, plants, animals, and all living things. Meanwhile, also in August, the Rio Cobre River in Jamaica was badly polluted by the Rusal-Windalco toxic spill. And so we see this again and again, that these extractive industries just have license to pollute the air, pollute the water. They pay very minor fines when they do so, or they declare bankruptcy and leave. That's what I mean by extractivism moves. It leaves behind its destruction and it moves to the next place. And finally, I just want to mention, of course, we've heard about Guyana today as well. And Exxon's oil drilling in Guyana, which began only in 2019, is expected to extract 800,000 barrels of oil a day in the coming years. And it is the largest source of fossil fuels anywhere in the world. That is, these offshore oil fields that are being exploited now off the coast of Guyana, and they're only 6 miles off the coast. And this is at a time when we know we need to reduce fossil fuels in order to deal with the climate emergency. And yet here is ExxonMobil developing the biggest fossil fuel oil extraction site in the world. And I've put on the right-hand side the cover of the book, The Extractive Zone by Macarena Gomez Barris, which I think offers some interesting ways to think about where can we go to get out of this pattern of extractivism. And I'll mention also that extractivism contributes to global warming and climate change, not only directly, but by feeding these cheap fossil fuels into the global north, where energy is overconsumed, filling the atmosphere with excessive CO2 emissions. So when we think about hurricanes in the Caribbean region or droughts, flooding, Caribbean climate vulnerability is not simply a natural fact, but is a result both of coloniality in the past and of extractivism today. That is, the colonial extractivism of climate change brings into view that what we call the Anthropocene, this era of human-caused climate change, is a racial process. It continues to produce racially uneven vulnerability and death, as Linda Pulido puts it. So there is an ongoing relationship of uneven consumption based on the exploitation and sacrifice of some peoples, some places, and ecologies for the benefit of others. So what can we do then to move beyond extractivism? So this was like a brief introduction to some of the problems of extractivism in the Caribbean, but I think it's really important that we also have the conversation about moving beyond it. Beyond extractivism, there are indigenous, maroon, and African descendant ontologies that are based in regenerative economies, i.e. circular systems that return energy, benefits, and care back to those who dwell there, rather than always taking out or depleting. And we heard Roger speak very eloquently about this in the first talk tonight. Beyond extractivism, there are alternative modes of human and more than human perception of living beings connected through social ecologies of sharing, in which we hold and care for others in common, which means setting limits on our use of energy, of water, of air, of resources, and of human relations. Beyond extractivism, there is attention to future livability, not only for humans, but for all living entities, and for the earth itself, for the seas, the rivers, the atmosphere. Beyond extractivism, we recognize that we are all interconnected in a relational web of life. Multifaceted knowledge formations already exist, which Gomez Barris calls the fisheye episteme, submerged within relational worldviews. So again, instead of separating ourselves from nature, if we immerse ourselves and are submerged within our relationality, we're more likely to be able to move beyond extractivism. To give just one example, after Hurricanes Irma and Maria in Puerto Rico, there was a movement, a social movement for building a just recovery. And many have written about this and thought about this, but the point is that people came together in the face of crisis to try to rebuild a safe, resilient, and thriving society. And that kind of work was rooted in this belief, argued by Elizabeth Yampierre and Naomi Klein, that the underlying reason behind all of Puerto Rico's intersecting crises is the fact that the island's people and land have been treated like a bottomless raw resource for the mainland to mine for over a century, never mind the devastating economic consequences. And that is true across the board, across the Caribbean, that these islands, once so beautiful and understood to be these beautiful, special places, have just been taken and taken and taken over and over and over again, leaving behind devastation ecologically, socially, and economically. So I want to just conclude with some thoughts that come out of the book I worked on called Island Futures, Caribbean Survival in the Anthropocene. And these are ideas that I think all of the panelists have talked a little bit about, that we must help to break the cycle of extractive economies fossil fuel consumption, tourism dependence, labor exploitation, and unsustainability that have really shaped the Caribbean for the last 500 years. And that we can learn, in particular, from agroecological projects, as Roger mentioned, how to expand Caribbean food sovereignty and resilience through things like regenerative low-till and no-till conservation agriculture, through multi-strata agroforestry, or silvopasture and tree intercropping. And these are all forms that dig deep into indigenous and African descendant and maroon traditions of using tropical staple trees, of using multi-crop gardening systems, which are known in some of the region as kanuko, which is an Arawak term, and expanding the prolific traditional root crops such as cassava, also known as yucca, which is able to survive hurricanes because it's under the ground. And these are ways of thinking about what would a resilient future look like. It means we would protect food sources, soil, water sources, coastal areas, mangroves, coral reefs, forests, begin huge programs of replanting and reseeding both the coral reefs and the mangrove forests to form what Haitian sociologist Jean Casimir has called the counterplantation. And there's a deep history of the existence and thriving and creation of the counterplantation, which is an anti-extractivist mode of living through which people survived enslavement and survived emancipation, to be frank, and found ways to keep living off of the land, with the land, and with the seas. We should also support mobile commons that enable people to share places, to share energy, to share resources and human labor in ways that are more respectful of limits, respectful of each other, respectful of plants, animals, water, and the other than human entities that we speak of as ancestors and spirits. And the image on the cover of my book comes from the Haitian American artist Edouard Duval-Carrier. And to me, it represents this image of a boat that's also an island in a sense. It's carrying all of the lois of the Vodou tradition and the important tree, which kind of gives life to everybody. And to me, these traditions within spiritual thinking connect also to indigenous and Native American traditions, which look at 7 generations into the future about what our impact is on the earth and on our future descendants, and also 7 generations back to our ancestors. So I will stop with those thoughts and look forward to our discussion and to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mimi, for giving us an overview of the breadth and scope of extractivism in the Caribbean. And I think this sets a great foundation for my closing remarks. And so what I'd like to do now in this segment is to respond with a human rights perspective to the discussion so far on extractivism. I'll situate my response at the intersection of human rights and decolonial theory. I'll start first with a very brief overview of the relevant human rights framework with a focus on the racial equality framework. I'll apply this framework to extractivism and then discuss how we can use human rights tools to promote futures beyond extractivism. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights envisions a social and international order in which fundamental rights can be fully realized in conditions of equality. International human rights law is based on the premise that all persons, by virtue of their humanity, should enjoy all human rights without distinction on any grounds. As such, all of the major human rights instruments prohibit discrimination, including structural discrimination. This racial equality framework, which we're accustomed to seeing in the domestic legal context, also applies to relations between countries. Specifically, international human rights law and major human rights documents establish principles of sovereign equality, rights-based development, and decolonization. International law, in theory, repudiates colonialism and global structural racial inequality rooted in sovereign inequality. Yet, contrary to this framework, extractivism, as we heard from the panelists, sustains a racial capitalist order that was literally designed by colonial powers to deprive racialized peoples of their fundamental rights. European colonizers invented doctrines of racial inferiority to justify extreme forms of domination and exploitation. And they created the system of extractivism to facilitate capital accumulation and their rapacious greed. So colonialism has formally ended, but colonial worldviews still dominate the colonial imaginary. I think this is what Patricia Northover referred to earlier as imperial formations that reproduce abject Blackness. And in this colonial imaginary, formerly colonized nations, such as those in the Caribbean, have been relegated to sacrificial zones of extraction, where they remain trapped in a vicious cycle of debt, dependency, and environmental devastation. As Mimi explained, the cumulative impact of centuries of colonial and contemporary extractivism presents as a serious threat to the Caribbean, including through climate crisis, the destruction of ecosystems, biodiversity loss, and the devastation of traditional livelihoods. So other webinars in this series on Beyond Extractivism will look at these impacts on specific communities. But the overarching point here is that all of this is a racial equality issue, since those who bear the brunt of the cost of extractivism are precisely those people who were once colonized on the basis of false notions of their racial inferiority. And even within the Caribbean, within Caribbean countries where I know race is not an issue that is frequently discussed, racialized communities that deviate from this colonial imaginary are systematically marginalized from public discourse, and their views are stigmatized as anti-development or anti-progress. These communities include Indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants, and rural communities whose way of life is being sacrificed for a colonial vision of progress. Of course, this is not just a racial equality issue. Discrimination and inequality within the extractivism economy, as in other contexts, is intersectional. In other words, it involves multiple intersectional social categories and structures of dominations. And so in the words of Audre Lorde, in a world where the good is defined in terms of profit rather than in terms of human need, there must always be some group of people who, through systematized oppression, can be made to occupy the place of the dehumanized inferior. This is perhaps what Patricia Northover meant when she referred to peoples who are perpetually vulnerable to a violence of expulsion. And within this order of things, that group is made up of Black and third world people, working class people, older people, and women. So what I'm describing here is a world order that is predicated not on equality and respect for rights, but rather on racial inequality and the deprivation of rights. The main authors of this order of things are former colonial powers who have integrated colonial territories and their economies into global markets under conditions of economic dependency. The authors are also transnational corporations who now operate as the new sovereigns, taking advantage of weak governance systems to make staggering profits. Global governance institutions are also complicit by pushing extractivist development as the seemingly inevitable fate of post-colonial societies. Importantly, local political elites and Caribbean governments are also complicit in the exploitation of their own people. And this for me just underscores what Paulo Freire demonstrates in The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is that the true focus of a revolutionary change is that piece of the oppressor, which is planted deep within each of us and which knows only the oppressor's tactics and the oppressor's relationships. So with this understanding, my most urgent question as a human rights lawyer is, does the human rights field have a decolonial gaze? How can human rights actors help us to build a future beyond extractivism, beyond racial capitalism, beyond coloniality? On this point, the UN expert on racism has called out human rights actors for failing to engage with the historically entrenched structures of racial oppression, exploitation, and exclusion that violate the human rights of racialized people. According to the UN expert, global structural inequality rooted in the histories and political economies of colonial and other forms of imperial subordination receives limited attention in mainstream human rights discourse and practice. This neglect, of course, is at odds with the principles of equality and non-discrimination. In other words, human rights actors are also complicit. as the UN expert on racism explained, to neglect the global structures of inequality and the global systems that promote or permit the consistent exploitation of certain nations and geographic regions at the expense of others is to endorse an international system that exists largely for the benefit of powerful nations and their transnational corporations. Nonetheless, on a more hopeful note, there are important things that human rights actors can do to help communities to build pathways to a future beyond extractivism. First, there are a number of human rights tools and standards that could be leveraged to empower affected communities to claim rights and build alternative futures. And I'll name just a few here. So I already discussed the overarching racial equality framework that ought to guide development in post-colonial societies. Beyond that, the framework of economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights is also important in protecting the livelihoods of racialized communities from extractivist development. Additionally, the framework for the protection of the rights of Indigenous peoples and Afro-descendant communities is also important. And a less publicized document called the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants establishes an important emerging foundation for the protection of the lands and livelihoods of rural peasants. Moreover, the emerging framework around the rights of nature, I think Catalina touched on this, is being used to defend communities against extractivist development. And recently, the recently concluded Escazú Regional Agreement provides a powerful platform for action and participation in environmental decision-making. And finally, the last thing I'll mention is the emerging legal framework around ecocide, which proposes to criminalize the environmental devastation that is implicit in extractivist development. But beyond the empowerment of specific vulnerable communities, which is important, we need to start addressing systems, not symptoms. Yes, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions is important. Yes, the strategic focus on fossil fuel extraction is important. But we will never achieve deep, meaningful change without addressing the underlying structures that cause these intersecting crises to occur. On this point, I think the framework of reparations in international law is a powerful tool for economic and social transformation towards a just post-colonial future. In this vein, the UN expert on racism explains that the legal obligation to provide reparations for slavery and colonialism requires states to dismantle structures of racial injustice that are the product of centuries of racial machinery built through slavery and colonialism. Extractivism must be understood as one such structure that is incompatible with a post-colonial, rights-based international order. Therefore, there is a legal and moral imperative to put in place alternatives free from all forms of exploitation. And these alternatives already exist. Across the Caribbean and across the globe, grassroots movements, Indigenous peoples, Afro-descendant and rural communities have already presented alternative development paradigms that represent values such as justice, solidarity, pluralism, democracy, and a sustainable relationship to nature. So as a human rights lawyer, my priority is identifying strategies to ally with movements for social and economic transformation. I believe that together, we can build a truly post-colonial future in which all humans thrive in equal dignity and harmony with nature. So with that, I'd like to thank you so much for listening, and I'll now move on to the question and answer segment. So our first question comes from John Mussington, and the question is, do you consider all-inclusive tourism as practiced in the Eastern Caribbean and other parts of our region as a form of extractivism? I am specifically referencing the situation where the tourist plants are foreign owned and controlled. And I think perhaps Mimi could present an answer to this, and maybe Catalina has follow-up comments to make.
Yeah, thank you, John, for that question. And absolutely, all-inclusive tourism is one of the forms of tourism that is often associated with extractivism. There's an excellent book by Matilda Cordoba Azcarate called Stuck with Tourism, which is about the Yucatan, but specifically has sections about all-inclusive resorts there. really goes into depth if you want to read more about how that form of tourism is not only extractive, it's predatory. That is, it preys on governments, on regions, on workers with the promise that this will bring them something good. The promise, the hope that the rebuilding of resorts will result in a better life for people. And it almost never does, right? And in part, as you say, when they're foreign owned and controlled, all of the profits are taken out. They are literally extracted and brought elsewhere. And of course, there are serious environmental consequences also of the building of tourist resorts on fragile coastal areas, the destruction of mangrove forests, the mining of sand to create the beaches with the illusion of nature. And there's an excellent film about this by Esther Figueroa, also called Jamaica for Sale, which tells some of the story of the development of the north coast of Jamaica. And lastly, I would just say that cruise ship tourism is also highly extractive in different ways and also very polluting.
Yes, thank you also to John and to Mimi for answering the question. That it's very important because this, for example, we find a lot of examples, for example, in Haiti. Do you remember the last earthquake in 2010? And 5 years before, what was built in Haiti was not the presidential palace, but the most important hotel, Marriott Hotel in Port-au-Prince, and also some other touristic mega projects. So, and you know, and you don't see the hospitals reconstructed or the houses of the people reconstructed. And we're seeing this also in some other islands in the Caribbean after the hurricanes, what we call the capitalism of disaster. Is related exactly with these touristic plans that are being made and want to be imposed in the islands after the hurricanes as a way of rebuilding capitalism in this, profiting from this disaster, creating more extractivism. When we talk about extractivism, it's also extracting not also land, not also water, because we're seeing also in the environmental justice atlas that I don't know if you know about. I'm putting it in the chat, ejatlas.org. This is what we do here. Joan Martinez Alieja is directing this project, is to map all the social and environmental conflicts related with different categories. In the case of tourism, there are a lot of examples, for example, in Costa Rica, which is seen as the home of the green tourism. And we see in these examples the contradictions and extraction of not only natural resources, but as one of our panelists has stated, imposing paradigms, ways of thinking in other places, and developing more dispossession, and also creating a lot of environmental conflicts. So I think one of the characteristics of extractive industries in the Caribbean absolutely is related with tourism, and we can relate also that with the big infrastructure of ports, or the cruisers just told us as a model of these extractive practices. So thank you, John, for asking.
Thanks so much, Catalina. And we have another question. The question is for Patricia, and this question is asking for a definition of ontology and hautology. I think I probably need that definition as well.
Hi. Hi, greetings again, everyone. Thanks for the question. I just wanted to preface by saying that in the logic of what we're critiquing extractivism, I think a very important point is to emphasize that it is really inbuilt into the development project. Now, development is a kind of sine qua non for existence insofar as it generates conditions of reproduction and production for ordinary living. But the real problem is the terms under which development is undertaken. So this is where we go back to the things about values and the fundamental metaphysical premises, political premises under which a development project is sustained. So development can only be conceived of not as an ontological thing, which is given, right? So what is, when people talk about, the real, so these are things that we take for granted. So even Hume, who's like a very classical skeptic about things like causality and causation, says that, yeah, but when you leave in the room, you're not going to walk through the wall, you're going to walk through the door. Okay, so our bodies are sensed to relate to the environment in ways that allows us to navigate and mediate the real. Now, the real is something that is obviously not just given to us. The very basic thing is that you're taught a language, there are conceptual frameworks through which, so like, based on the language systems and the cultural context in which you come from, you see differently. So like, when you look at indigenous cultures and they talk about the real for them, you like would blow your mind because you couldn't see what they're already seeing in the world, right? So they already have an advanced ontological conception of what is, which is different from perhaps Western cosmology, which is grounded in a logic of transparency or science. So like science gives you the sense that, okay, you can almost take like a bird's eye view or a God's eye view, and you just look down on the world and you see everything, and everything becomes transparent to you, and everything is objectively given by your knowledge lens, which is, allows you then to pronounce on the world, right? So that was used for race. So race, is that an ontological category? All right, and we know everybody says, well, what is race? We're 99.9% exactly the same DNA structure. So what exactly is it? So scientists have said, okay, it's classifications and these modes in which we can group particular alleles in the genetic framework to make distinctions between so and so. And then some people say, oh no, it's ethnicity. No, some people say it's a social construct. Well, Blacks live race as basically a ontology, right? It's something that is imposed that creates a distortion of the being and even your capacity to relate to the real. So that when you are, and all of us, and I mean all of us who come from that kind of heavy politicization of our bodies through certain categories of structural, epistemic, symbolic, the whole frame, all the different kinds of violence you can talk about, which are rehearsed in race, means that you can't appear in the world, It's that you're there, but you're not there. And when you try to appear, you are seen as being violent. So like one of the terms that whites would use, for example, against slaves who were, dared to in a sense to project back a reality that they believed in that was different from the masses, that you're uppity, right? You're to your place, right? So, and Blacks in the United States constantly talk about really feeling like aliens, right? They're from another planet. And some of them, Afrofuturism generates a whole cosmology around space travel. And Blacks are very into science fiction because it so resonates with their kind of non-being being, right? No, what do we think of when we think of non-being beings? We think Duppy, right? Ghosts, right? Oh my God, something in the room. I sense a presence, right? No, I'm not dissing spiritual phenomena because I'm a spiritual person, right? But what I'm trying to tell you is that this is something you can't see. You can't pin down like a scientist and, okay, let me go and get my magnifying glass and see if I can see this presence, right? It's almost like Blackness. You're there, but you're invisibilized in particular ways, racialized in particular ways that make your capacity capacity to be present, which is a concept, right, of place that is used in philosophy. So like, it's not just your being there, but your capacity to be there. And if that is being erased and fundamentally subdued by these notions of what is, right, ontology. So what am I? I'm a Black person. What does that mean? So Blacks have had to reinvent themselves, right, out of a cosmology in which they were being erased, obliterated, their cultures, their knowledge, their sense of themselves, their ontologies, their cosmologies. So they emerge within modernity as a ghostly figure, right? And they're like how Marx says communism is haunting capitalism. Well, within capitalism, there's another ghost, which is Blackness, right? Blackness, which is in a sense an incoherent concept because it has no real signifier. It has no real attachment to the real. It's something that's projected in the world through a symbolic imaginary that is rooted in sovereign relationships of power. That's why I emphasize sovereignty and imperial formations in my presentation, because what I'm trying to argue that the fundamental problem that we have is the way in which our state formations are being characterized by a very, very new idea of what sovereignty is. Sovereignty in modernity means the absolute capacity to do something, which means that when I take in everything, there's no space left for anything else. Right? So that absolute absorbs everything in itself. No, that's impossible. So what emerges out of that politics of absorption, that politics of totalization or totalitarian regimes of control is Creole capacities, right? Obviously, you can't do that to the world. Obviously, I'm not going to listen to you. Obviously, I'm a person, even if you tell me I'm not a person. So that what you have are strategies of resistance, accommodation, flight, all sorts of things, so that development itself, coloniality itself becomes a project, not something that is given, which is ontology, but something that is being produced, which is process. And the character of the process that we live as Blacks in the world is that it is largely through these spectral characteristics of our being, or quasi-visibility, right? A white person in America can look at you and it's like you're not there, right? Or you can say something, it's like you're not there, right? And how do you explain that? What conceptual language can we use to explain that not being there, even though you're damn well there, right? You feel like you're a ghost in that system, but you're a haunting ghost because guess what? They're scared of you, right? So the duppy brings chills out when a white person say a Black person, I'm looking him away, I'm like, geez, my whole system is going to collapse. And that's true, because Blackness threatens whiteness. And if Blackness is affirmed, it threatens the whole cosmology of whiteness. So they're right to feel that this duppy is going to get them, right? This haunting is something just like communism threatens capitalism. Well, Blacks are the fundamental weak point, Haiti, right? The concepts that we live, but it's always complicated by the fact that development is something that we have to do. We have to eat, we have to live. So slaves had plots, and therefore they were creolizing food systems, but food systems are essentially totalitarian regimes, right? Monoculture, mono this, everything is based on one single narrative. I'm trained as an economist, and this notion of Pareto efficiency is a complete fiction. But we have entire theories geared towards telling you when you're operating on an optimal level in market systems to get at some completely fictional notion of what efficiency means, and then you have a technology and a political and a social frame. So our systems are produced, right? They're not just given. So ontology, if you're going to use it, it must be a process ontology. And if you are, as a Black person speaking from my perspective, then you have to twist that somewhere, right? Because that obviously that narrative of ontology, even when you have process, is just inadequate to explain what you're going through. So you have to have a new language. And that for me is what hauntology means. Does that help?
Wow, thanks so much, Patricia. That helped me a whole lot, and I'm sure it was very helpful for the audience. And as always, my mind has been blown. So thanks so much, Patricia. So we have another question from Maxine Plummer. And the question is, those who are the creators of this extractivism culture are not looking beyond extractivism, since this is what gives them political clout. Is there a sustainable movement that can make an impact in reducing this culture? So do we have a panelist who wants to respond to this question? I can also provide perspectives as everyone collects their thoughts. So I think, as the poll shows and as the panelists said, these alternative futures are already being imagined, and they are already being built by communities. There are multiple perspectives on decolonizing the social and economic order. So for example, there is the environmental perspective that emphasizes this idea of buen vivir, or living well. There's also an indigenous communitarian perspective. There is an ecofeminist perspective that focuses on the care economy and the struggle against patriarchy. There's an eco-territorial position linked to ideas of environmental justice, common goods, food sovereignty. And within this framework, as Catalina mentioned, this rights of Mother Earth has been put forward as an alternative to the current anthropocentric paradigm. And these rights already exist in some constitutions in the hemisphere. So to summarize, these movements are taking place. I think the task now is for us to build solidarity across movements, across disciplines, across fields of practice, and to try to develop a shared understanding of common issues and possible solutions, and then to drive collective action around that. And so with that, I will invite any other panelist who wants to make a contribution.
I just want to add to that Milena made a very important point in her own talk that maybe we could reemphasize, which is that, as Maxine says, the practicers of extractivist culture do not limit themselves. They're not the ones who are involved in these movements. And that's why we need to use legal tools. We need to use the legal system and to try to demand limits, demand reparations, demand justice, because it's one of the few tools we have to sort of use against those in power. The other tools have been used, right? Maroons escaped from the system. Revolutionaries tried to overthrow the system, but within the sort of existing legal frameworks, there is still room to, I think, try to rein in some of the extractivism that's occurring now.
Thanks so much, Mimi. And I see Pat has her hand up.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say that one of the things about how you get at it, there's a concept that is put out there by Walter Benjamin called a profane illumination. But for me, I think that this kind of critical consciousness and awakeness that you need to respond to your context of severe environmental degradation is something that's not going to come through a voluntary process. I don't personally think that. I think that Mother Earth, the cosmology, is going to have a hand in it, because basically we're breaching environmental limits. We have breached environmental limits, like the 1.5 to stay alive is already a ghost because it's not going to happen, right? It's an ambition that, based on the structural dynamics of the system that we're inhabiting and the rates of production, accumulation, and reproduction that we're in, we already have fallen off the cliff in a sense, and it requires in some ways that process of our vulnerability to violence and our vulnerability in those contexts of catastrophic loss to create the necessary political ingredients for that type of action to start taking place across the world in different ways where you can't anticipate it, to somehow try to live differently. No, I am not really a pessimistic person. Well, I think sometimes I can be, but my point would be saying that there are levers beyond human control which are involved in this process. And for me, the fact that we had COVID-19, that is not a natural phenomenon. It's because of zoonotic diseases which emerge once every 4 months now because of our failed global food systems and how they have massacred environmental spaces, biodiversities, and regimes, ecological regimes. So my sense is that we, in a sense, we have to depend as human beings on the catastrophic systems that we're living in to shake and to wake and to realize that the death that we're confronting is not a mirage. The ghosts that are haunting us are not just screaming out of sheer, being nonsensical. They're like saying, shit, damn, it's almost like we're already dead and we need to find a resurrection mode for living on the planet. And I don't know how that's going to be done, but I agree with Rosie at the beginning that the imagination and the re-remembering and a miracle. multiple miracles, which as Black people, we're completely depend on because we don't know where the next meal coming from, but we pray and go down on our knees and say, yes, God, I trust you for this. Yeah, so that's the kind of spiritual tradition I believe in. I believe in miracles, and that somehow we're going to pull it off to push back imperialism, because state systems are grounded in our bodies, and therefore we have to use our bodies and nature, the fact that it's undergoing these systemic changes, to wake up everything and make it a different set of possibilities. So I don't think humanism alone is really going to cut it.
Well, thank you so much again, Patricia, for your, as always, insightful comments. So it's now 2 minutes past 5, and so we are a little over time. So what I will do is perhaps continue for a few more minutes so we can get to some of the other questions. But for those of you who have to run, please feel free to reach out on social media or at the email address that I'll share in the chat, and let us know any questions you have. And perhaps what I should do is, give a closing and a vote of thanks, and then we can continue with the questioning, because I think it's very interesting and important. So of course, thank you so much to the panelists for their excellent interventions. For me, this was a learning experience, and I'm so happy that you agreed to join the panel and to really elevate the discourse today. And I want to give a very special thank you to Dwight Brown. Dwight is our fantastic technical expert who allowed us to convene efficiently on Zoom. So thank you, Dwight. We appreciate you so much. Thank you also to Esther Figueroa and Emile Martens for hosting this event as a special event in the Global Extraction Film Festival. So please look out for other webinars in the series on Beyond Extractivism. If you'd like to participate, please feel free to connect with us. We'd love to hear from you. So for those who can stay, feel free to stick around for some additional discussion. And for those who have to go, thank you so much for joining, and hopefully see you next time.
Yeah. So I said Dwight is ghosted himself. We can't see him.
Right. Put a spotlight on yourself, Dwight.
Come on, Dwight, be brave. Thank you.
Oh, very nice. Thanks so much, Dwight.
No problem. It's been great.
Okay. So we have another question in the chat. Is it possible for us to have a translation of this presentation in at least one Caribbean language? I'm thinking of ICIAN, the language of IT. So yes, absolutely. And I think that is extremely critical. And what we should have done with this presentation is we should have had simultaneous translation into the languages of the Caribbean, as opposed to the colonial languages, which were imposed upon us and which our governments continue to mainstream through education, public bodies, and that sort of thing, to the exclusion of our local languages. So what I can say is that I will try my very best to provide some version of this presentation in another Caribbean language. It may not be the entire presentation, but it will be perhaps a synopsis, but I will definitely try. Okay, now we had another question in the chat, and I'm not sure if Earl Bailey is here. Perhaps I'll read this out, or let me ask the panelists, did you have any other additional comments you wanted to make? Okay, so let me read this comment from Earl Bailey. Do you think that the emphasis on extractivism is too focused on capitalist anthropocentric activities and on the effects of human health and wealth? Do you think that the simple analogy of the tragedy of the commons needs to be revisited? Since the essential psychological problem with sustainability is that humans inherently think that those who will come after us will have life better, and thus no need to seriously consider them, I am also concerned that the phenomenon of urbanization has not been mentioned or explored as the major driving force behind extractivism, and the fact that this phenomenon is undervalued in the Caribbean. So Roger, I see Roger has a response. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I start with that last point about urbanization, getting some sun here at my location. You know, I mentioned it briefly in my opening remarks, but urbanization is another example of a pattern of human civilization that's based on what I call the background programming of separation, in that it, as I'm sure you're probably aware based on your question, it takes a environment, generally destabilizes any type of cycle, which is production, consumption, decomposition, reintegration, and then turns a living space into what Lear Keith calls dead commodities, and then requires the constant importation, even if it's just a local importation, of sustenance in order for what's now a dead area to exist and thrive. And that requires extractivism. So, you know, at its heart, you know, human settlement is not essentially separate and extractivist, but the pattern of human urban settlement has given rise and created the necessity for extractivist paradigms of being, which I keep going back to. For me, what needs to be probed is our ways of being as human beings, since that's what we're here to do, to be in a particular way. And so, and this just gets magnified at certain scales. It then becomes wars and imperialism, it becomes colonialism. And you see the form of human organization at its probably the basic unit, the basic social unit, that being a particular city or an urban culture, is an essential tipping point in the progression of human civilization along an extractivist pathway. And built upon that is just larger degrees of scale of how we've chosen to organize ourselves. And so that background programming, how do human beings organize themselves? How do they organize their affairs? How do they structure the way that they settle? Is a root issue. I don't think, one of the things extractivism also does has unidimensional thinking, and so it's not. I don't think there's the root issue other than separation. But urbanization is a critical one, and the ability of the collective imagination to remember and imagine a way of organizing human affairs that does not take for granted urbanization, does not assume urban culture, does not seek to simply find cleaner energy and inputs to sustain urban culture, is really the question of our time. You know, a lot of this just rests on urbanization as a process, but also it's just the culture, the urban culture, which is just another term in present language for the form of human settlement that emerged from separation. So we will always have different terms throughout time. So I take your point strongly here that this is a major driving force. It's a major driving force of much of the ecological disaster we've seen. Roads, you know, roads are not just transports. Roads are transports to this. Like, another day we talk about that. But the roads create pathways for more extractivism. It's the way that extractivism moves as a network. And so there's just so much wrapped up that is taken for granted in urban culture. But one of the interesting and really pernicious effects of urban culture is the socialization out of community. So when you think of an urban locale, there are neighborhoods perhaps, but the way of living and relating to other human beings and other forms of life in urban cultures is markedly similar across urban cultures, in that it creates an ecosystem that distances us from each other and distances us from nature by virtue of its constitution. And so the process of remembering, unlearning, and imagining a way of living as part of Earth and a planetary consciousness also requires us to confront directly in front of us the elements of the way that we've organized our society that obstruct that. You know, urban living is a big part of that. It's built upon selling time for money. It's built upon limited relationship with one's sustenance because you're not engaged. You know, even if you don't have to farm for your life, but the urban culture is particularly sustained on, and I have no problem with money, but it's sustained on setting time for money and using money to buy things that were extracted, and then moving your waste where you can't see it. That's effectively the cycle of urban culture. And those core assumptions about that we need that to organize will always reproduce extractivist outcomes, no matter the flavor, no matter the lesser evil. That's really the form of separation that would need to be probed frontally in order for human settlement to to transition from extractivist to stewardship, or for regenerative solutions to be developed that allow for certain ways of life to exist without having to be undone. And so I think that's a very valuable intervention, Earl, and something that I think is really relevant. Really, to the first part of your question about, I'm getting full sunlight now. Do you think the emphasis on extractivism is too focused on capitalist anthropocentric activities and on the effect of human health and wealth? Well, I don't really think it's a matter of if it's too focused on capitalist anthropocentric activities. I think it's sort of, to me, it doesn't really, capitalism is the language that is available for the form of separation, as I mentioned, that characterize modern human relations in quote unquote modernity or otherwise. And so I don't think it's an issue of too focused. What I would say is that I think we need to be clear when that systems are layered, and so a belief system based on separation will produce capitalism, and it maybe will produce something else with another ism. And so I don't find an issue with the focus or the reference to the context of capitalism, nor with a focus on anthropocentric activities, because that's oftentimes a domain in which our separation plays out and needs to be cured, or healed, I should say. And the point about the effect on human health and wealth, that's actually the function of separation, in that value is defined and located in its proximity to human beings. This is also the limitation of human rights law. And so to the degree that value continues to be located, quantified, and made sense of in relationship to human beings, we will not be able to value the inherent life and dignity of the earth, because we would view ourselves as separate inhabitants of the earth, not members of a living ecosystem. And the illusion of that separation creates space for us to think about things like the impact on human health, not recognizing that the health of the planet is the health of the human being. And so that's the illusion that allows us to have a discourse about justifying whatever extraction we're doing about in relation to the benefits to human beings. One, it's an illusion that it's a benefit to human beings. We're seeing it right now. But two, that type of rationalization is just not possible in a space of stewardship. It requires separation, because then it's when you say the benefits to human beings, what's in the background in the shadow and therefore what's done is justified, what is the detriment of others. Otherwise, the issue of benefit, non-benefit, which is a competitive and adversarial logic, doesn't come in. It's if you're viewing things through a lens of union. I hope that makes sense in the reference to what I said earlier. And so that's really the crux of it. And again, that what you just said there in the chat is a system of value. It is values itself and morals and that kind of stuff. Is also how you're able to locate value. And again, much of that is subconscious. And so once you expose it into awareness, you can't really unsee it. And then you view the world, as Patricia and Mimi were saying, the lens through which you view the world is just different. So the people who will view the world and just, we won't be able to have the same value calculus, because our sense of what the real world is, especially the metaphysical world, and I'm so happy we're able to have that conversation, that the formula will just change, and therefore value will just be calculated so fundamentally differently that there's just no space for extractivist ideas, and really only space for unified consciousness, I would say. But there are also many small steps involved in that, which I know that feels like a big thing. So yeah, that's my response to you, Earl.
Thanks so much, Roger. Extremely insightful. I think, is that Patricia's hand up? Patricia, did you want to say something?
If I may, I don't want to be too dominant on the floor, but I just wanted to say that I'm a little bit uncomfortable when we use terms in a sort of monolithic way. So even capitalism, urbanization, development, I see all of these as heterogeneous processes. So like the name is just a way of signifying to the real, you know, that you're trying to talk to it and you want to engage with it, and you're trying to have some form of communicative dynamic so people can have a sense of what you want to talk about. But I feel these processes are inherently complex and differentiated across time and space. And for example, city life in Kingston is very much integrated with rural spaces. So there is, to some extent, a constant kind of unsettling of the narratives of what urbanization is or should mean or whatever it is, or, you know, like we're going to build a third city and then we have this big development plan, and then that plan is then being rehearsed according to a narrative and a normative about what is. That's what I would really push back again, those projects, right? Those I see, I know, and this is my stamp on reality, and everybody must fit into it, right? This enclosure process. And I think that's what's the damaging element. But the fact is, it's a project, it's an attempt to do something that literally is not possible, because reality itself is rooted in heterogeneity, in living systems, in these complex processes. So I don't like talking about, a single mapping of the world. I like to think about things in terms of their heterogeneity or their complexity. And I don't think that when you look at even at the nation state, it's riddled with social fields that go beyond it. When you look at urban spaces, rural spaces, it's all about these interrelationships and entanglements, which I mean, really, how do we find urban? Rural is the subtraction from the urban, and the rural is the subtraction. It's really just an analytical tool that just, statistics is really invention of categories. It's like growth. I mean, we measure growth, but we know 50% of most economies are not in growth statistics, right? Because they're informal and they're not picked up by the statistics that we have to measure it. But we still talk about, oh, we're going to get 5% growth today or last year. What does it mean? It's our routinization and our need to normalize and, to know one step forward and the next step. And you wake up at 7 a.m. and I mean, what do these things mean? It's the reality is so much more complex than the projections that we have on it. So I just wanted to say that as a caveat to how we then project solutions. My biggest problem with this whole extractivism discourse is that we are locked into what someone called Laura Berlant, who's recently passed, a cruel optimism, right? That is, we're optimistic that if we do certain things, we're going to get particular outcomes. But we're really like children of Sisyphus, in that we have a rock that we keep trying to go up this hill, but it keeps rolling back down. Right? But it gets worse than that. I mean, I was reading something that was talking about laws of growth and scale and all of that. And what it was saying is that systems have been so disrupted, no matter how many innovative solutions that we think about today, the pace and rate of what we need to do in relationship to what's happening is just insufficient. So it's like, even if we, all of these all of these these kind of solutions, which are optimism that we can make things work in a system that's broken and that's like dead already, but we're kind of thinking, okay, keep, you know, we call that thing when you do it and you have that, I think, the electric shock, right? And you, yeah, no, it's not dead. Let's, you know, you're trying to resuscitate. Well, I think that's what capitalism, or whatever you want to call it, is a world system, a world historical system that's differentiated across time and space, that is, in a sense, producing death outcomes at this point in time, and that we're in a certain optimistic vein that we can make a difference, and we must, because we're human beings. But for me, I really not sure, because I think what we have are, in a sense, well, I don't know. I should stop talking, but for me, the sense is that the situation that we're in is at an impasse. We're at an impasse, and it requires a real fundamental orientation of difference that would discombobulate, disrupt, or way of thinking, like how COVID did, right? Up to a point, it kind of just threw everybody off. We need to have, like, you know, I'm not trying to preach in doom or anything like that, but I'm just saying that the system itself is going to have to keep throwing us certain kind of balls that we can't hit until it re-establishes a right relationship with it, with the planet. And I don't know, I'm optimistic because, like I said, I believe in things that are, because what we know is just 20% really of everything that there is. So I'm optimistic that 80% can make a difference to the unknown, the things that are unthinkable can make a difference to how we end up. But we are really trapped in a logic of cruel optimism now with the development projects that we have, that we keep moving forward with, but really are like trying to push a hill up a rock and it keeps falling back down.
Thanks so much, Pat, for your intervention. I see that Catalina has her hand up as well. I'm just going to read a quick question, and then perhaps you can make your comment. And if you have any responses to this question, you can also make them. So this question is, what is the role that poorly educated politicians or local elected officials plays in fostering extractivism, since they are usually responsible for enacting laws that suit the objectives of the capitalists running world government? Is extractivism the problem, or the disposition of the locals, of their lands and the disruption of their daily lives, given the fact that extractivism did occur pre-colonially, but to the benefit of indigenous peoples on a level that did not disrupt nature? So Catalina, perhaps you can make your intervention, and then if you have any thoughts on that question as well.
Well, I wanted to say something about just what the point on urbanization, and I was thinking about what Patricia just told us about this heterogeneity reality where we all living here from Colombia, for example, when you talk about urban spaces, and where we are in a reality of misery belts, of people displaced by the war we're living. So our urbanization is very particular to our political history. So when we talk about urbanization model, it depends where we are and the connections we have with one another in relation with these other parts, or these solutions we cannot see because we only know the 20% of this reality. Well, there's something that we have learned in this COVID-19 isolation, is that I think one of the important concepts that it was Roger has bring out is this idea of separation. We have in these virtual spaces came to talk together in the inimaginable space. And this virtuality has bring us together. We are all over the Caribbean. We're in isolated spaces. The natural insular reality has our relations that are only being historically created with the colonial center of powers, and the governments are the expressions of that. So I think to change this reality of this government question about is that the politicians, well, I don't know if it's the case all over, but what we're seeing is that the extractive industry, the so-called extractive industry, because there are no industries, because they don't create jobs, they don't create anything, they don't create, they don't invent something new, they're only extracting and exporting, is that they are the ones who are creating the new government. The power today in Latin America is very linked to this monopoly of the extractive industries, and every day our presidential or local elections are guided and funded by these extractive industries. But we are also seeing that there are other possibilities, and that possibilities, for example, Malin just touched one of these alternatives that we are creating in Latin America, is what we are creating in the streets and the social movements, in the creating this idea of communal, the new commons that are being, that we are creating in the local territories, and also including what just Pat said, what we don't know that came, we don't know by which ways, but that is there. I think we are also responsible for creating these new ways of thinking and being and living and avoiding this separation. That is, I think I agree with Roget, that is the key concept of extractivism, to try to build some common ground where we can work together. And I think that is very potent, well, for us in Latin America and in the Caribbean also, to build these common grounds of action, lawsuits, for example, movements that are beyond our government legal systems, when we can create broader communities of sense. That is one of the way of building sense in a very heterogeneous world where we live in. That was something I wanted to say, so thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Catalina, and thanks again to all of our amazing panelists for presenting, very important decolonial perspectives on extractivism. And to our audience, thank you so much for joining and to staying a little longer to hear the continued debate. And I encourage you to visit us, to email us at info@freedomimaginaries.org with your additional questions. So hope to see you in our future webinar series. And thanks so much again.
Thanks, Malin, for your energy and for your vision and for your coordination and just hard work that made this possible as well.
Thank you very much,
Thanks so much, Pat. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. It was a gem.
So